in before ThoughtBat gets wrecked up his rectum like he usually does. Okay.
No,
I'm just gonna
right.
keep bullying this nigga. I'm
I've
sorry.
just started the recording
Oh,
because both people have suggested that they would like it recorded. So I'm going to unmute ThoughtBat. There he is. Let me unmute MrCuddles. Was he there? You should both be able to speak unless you're muted at your own ends. This is being recorded. I'm going to pop out a quick ping just so that people know where they can come to listen. There is no format agreed, so it's just going to be an exchange of views. It's not really a debate. We're just using this channel for convenience. So everyone, ThoughtBat and MrCuddles are discussing. What are you discussing? It's something to do with economics, right? What's the best way for me to word it?
Oh, I think it's just broadly. I think ThoughtBat is a mutualist, and I just said I'm partial to anarcho-communism. So I think we're sort of just discussing maybe some nuances of either position.
these are fighting words.
Just say mutualism.
Discussing mutualism. Oh, welcome. And we might do like a little bit of a Q&A at the end. Is that okay? If anybody has any questions.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay with that.
Okay. Now, come join. Right, there goes the ping. If anybody has any like follow along, please just use the VC text or VC links channel as appropriate. And with that, I will be quiet because I don't think anybody's got any opening statements. So let's just hear you guys discuss it.
Yeah, fair enough. So, Cuddles, I think you said you had some questions, and that's going to be the basis of the conversation. Then you're free to start with those.
Yeah, I'll probably just broadly ask you, because I know there's probably some nuance of the position. Just broadly speaking, say like when you say you're a mutualist, what concept are you specifically trying to highlight or point out?
So I'm talking about free market anti-capitalism. So I discussed in one of my previous AMAs that capitalism is specifically to be defined as commercial trade operating through a medium which consists on private or absentee property rights. And so what I mean by absentee property rights is property which you own but you don't physically use on a regular basis. So I'm not talking about your own home. I'm not talking about the food in the fridge or the clothes in your wardrobe. I'm talking about rental properties, private businesses which you don't really operate within, those kinds of things.
Yeah,
so
the personal private property distinction. That one.
Yes, it's slightly different though. It is slightly different because I think the Marxist one, private/personal, is very much dependent on what you do with that property. So property rather.
I thought it
so
had
for
to do with
example,
ownerships. I thought it has to do with relationships of ownership. Like if you own the means of production, or if they can be owned, right? I think that's sort of I thought that's how it's done. I don't think it was like I know that it's different because I think mutualists would say that like you can own land, but as if you're not using it, that's when it becomes a problem. Where they might say that land is just private property, period, or something like that.
Yeah. So what Proudhon, who was like the first mutualist, first anarchist even, he said possession/property. Now by property he meant permanent land titles, and by possession he meant just things that you physically possessed, like things like the clothes you're wearing, the clothes that's maybe in your wardrobe and that kind of thing. But that wasn't property to him. But I don't like that distinction because for me, property ought to be defined as an object which you have exclusive rights of access to. So if we're talking about the clothes in your wardrobe, then we probably both agree that you have exclusive rights to those clothes in your wardrobe, for example. So they would be our property. But I think you being an anarcho-communist and me being a mutualist, we both agree that absentee property, at least absentee property, is unjustified because that kind of, well, I haven't gone through my justification for property rights just yet. My justification for property rights doesn't scale up to those kinds of absentee property ownership.
Yeah, it doesn't scale up. Yeah, we would both agree there, and we're both generally anti-capitalist. So for the most part, when it comes to like certain critiques of capital, that's probably not going to find too much disagreement on. I guess the difference is that like under mutualism, because it would be hard to call it collective ownership, or certainly not common ownership. So I guess it's sort of like weird, where it's technically not private property, but it doesn't seem like collective ownership either. It's like a very sort of like individual ownership. But I know individualism was a pretty big part of mutualism, at least in Proudhon's time.
Yeah. So if you talk about workers' cooperative, some definitions would say it's private property. I think even Marxism would call that private property because going back to what I was trying to get at before, Marx would call private property which you draw an income from. So if I own a laptop and I just use it to do whatever I want with it, like I just Google stuff, I just play some games on it, that's personal property for Marx. But as soon as I start doing work on it and start earning an income off it, so if I do computer-aided design, for example, then that computer would become private property because I'm drawing in a profit from it. Now, obviously, there's no classifier because I am the owner and also the worker of that. So what the workers of a cooperative are doing with their capital or their industry or their factories or whatever, they are enacting labour on it and they're drawing a profit from it. And so Marx would call that private property.
I have to look. I'm not specifically. Admittedly, I'm not the most read on Marx specifically, but I'm not necessarily sure because I'm not sure the idea of a profit isn't sort of the idea. I think it has more to do with capital, or is it like money that makes more money? That's the reason that like renting a house can be seen as private property because money being used to make more money. There's actually no labor. Typically, there's no labor involved, and that's sort of what defines a capitalist to begin with. Is someone who makes profit off of not working. Basically, they're making money off of the work of others. They're not working themselves though. So the fact that you're doing work into the computer directly would sort of make it that it would just be a sort of a single self owner, but you would still be owning the means of production. Whereas if you had people working on some computer firm for you, that would be private in the sense that you're still gaining all the profits from said commodity, but you're not doing any of the work to generate that. It's money being used to make more money, kind of thing. But I'll have to look more into that specifically, the distinction like money, commodity, money stuff.
I'm not so sure because I would decline to say that Jeff Bezos does zero work being the CEO of Amazon. Like he does managerial work, that sort of intellectual labor side. So he does put work into it, even if not all the labor into it. So like where would we put an owner manager in that case? Like if you own a small business and
the profits, right? It has to do with where are the profits coming from, right? When it comes to all the sales of Amazon and all these things are Amazon, they're not coming to the workers, right? They're not coming to the people delivering it. They're getting paid a flat wage regardless of whatever sales of companies. So I think now that's where Marx comes in and says all the excess wages that would be paid to the workers, the money that's being paid as surplus, that is the extracting. So he's working and he's getting a wage for his job, but the actual profits from the majority profits is coming from the actual labor of the workers. That's like the more labor theory thing, which admittedly I don't subscribe to, but that's typically where it goes. It's that the manager of any firm is getting all the sales, all the profits is coming from that. And necessarily speaking, if I want to make a profit, I'm going to have to, because paying people is a cost, I'm going to necessarily have to pay them less than whatever thing I'm making it if I want to make a profit. And Marx would call that part the exploitation. That's where that's coming in.
So the key factor is the so you're saying the key factor might be the class divide then.
I'm saying yeah, because you're mentioning specifically Marx, and Marx was definitely calling about the class divide. That's sort of how he distinguishes between that private and property. He's just who owns and who doesn't, or that's usually that relationship is typically how he tends to define private property. I disagree with liberal theory of value for a few other reasons. Mostly, I just find it trivial, but yeah.
Yeah, I'm not too certain on labor theory of value myself. Even though mutualists, like classical mutualists or orthodox mutualists or whatever you want to call them, they have quite a strict labor theory of value. Like Proudhon talked about like what's the price of a shoe. Then Proudhon said, well, how many nails is a shoe worth or a pair of shoes worth? And Proudhon said, well, it's actually exactly how many nails take in the same time it takes to make a shoe. But I think, as far as I agree with the Labour theory of value, is that exchange value, pretty much comes from labour. But I don't know if you can measure it strictly according to how many labour hours you put into a commodity.
I think because exchange value is just price, and that could be complete. And I think he made a distinction there. I think this is like the whole thing about the diamond mortar paradox, was that there was a distinction between basically use value, which is how useful is this thing, and its exchange value, which is its price. That's and its price does not even have to be connected to its labor in any way. But he was just saying that the actual, price of the commodity is the socially necessary labor time. What it's sold for is almost an entirely separate question.
Yeah, as if price isn't indicative of value or something like that. I'm not comfortable with that, because for me, value needs to have a valuer, and so for it to have a value, so if humans didn't exist, or if sentient beings didn't exist, then the Earth would be completely valueless. Who's it valuable to? No one. So, in order to have value, I define value as the affinity to act in order to attain or maintain. So if I value my laptop, I'm always talking about a laptop as an example because it's the thing that's in front of me. But if I value my laptop, I have an affinity to act in order to try and maintain or attain it.
And that sounds like use value, right? Because exchange value is just the price, right? So the question is, does price tend to encapsulate this? And the answer is probably not. This is why the diamond water paradox was a thing, right? Because water is technically something that we all need to live, but it's pretty dirt cheap and it's kind of everywhere. So it definitely just seems that in a lot of cases, what is necessarily useful, maybe to people, and what its price is worth, is usually not always connected. There's definitely a lot of points where it disconnects.
Yeah, and so I think where I'd agree in terms of diamonds, where I'd agree with the labour theory of value is, well, if the diamonds are still stuck in the ground, they're going to be worth nothing. Like, okay, you can let's say I own them. I haven't done any labour to bring them out of the ground, and I don't intend to. What worth are they? Like, no one values diamonds, which are just stuck in the ground. To make the diamonds valuable, or for people to want the diamonds, there has to be labour enacted upon them, or a potential for the labour to be applied to them in order to bring them out of the ground and stick them in a ring. So to me, that's the origin of why something is valuable.
Yeah, that almost kind of sounds like labor theory. You're saying that the diamond is not the valuable, but the labor that you have to put in to extract the diamond is what makes it valuable, or something like that.
Yeah, because you need it, don't you? You need the labor to manipulate things.
Exactly, and that's why Marx said like labor is a core source of value and whatnot.
Yeah. So I agree that labor is a source, but I disagree. I think you disagree as well, from what you said before, that the absolute value, and I'm going to call it the value behind the scenes, because it's not price.
Basically,
it's a value that we don't know about. The value that we don't know about is measured according to labor hours and all the rest of it. And I just don't think there is really. So yeah, I think that's that one covered. So you mentioned something about the profit motive, and you've got a problem with that. Do you want to go ahead and define the profit motive for me?
Yeah, generally speaking, the mode of capital accumulation is to, maximize profit. And of course, we sort of discuss how this sort of works under a capitalist system, is that, I have to, if I want to secure a profit, I'm going to need to pay the workers less than whatever's coming in, or pay them as low as possible, if possible. So there's definitely sort of incentive there. And this sort of does entail usually a growth model. Typically, if you're not growing, you're dying. There's always that potential that if you don't secure a large portion of the market, you will just have the potential to just be outcompeted. And generally speaking, because of how market cycles tend to go, there's sort of also an incentive to try to stick your foot into as many areas as possible. That way, if market shortages happen, you don't completely go bankrupt. So typically, that's how the profit motive goes. And a lot of the socialist critiques of that is that, well, seems to be a lot of problems of capitalism as it is now. Climate change was a big one. Why aren't we trying to look towards our alternative sources? Well, it wouldn't be possible to the fossil fuel industry, and they have tons of money, so they can and do fuel disinformation campaigns. They lobby against our government to, deny any form of thing against climate change. And, Yeah, it's sort of a lot, but I think that's sort of core to what profit is, that we're trying to maximize profit as much as possible. And the entailments of that often usually entails encouraging certain behaviors that I might find undesirable.
So your problem might be there's a disconnect between a profit motive or an individual's profit motive and the what is good for humanity or something
Yeah,
like that.
that is the core issue. Yeah, what is profitable and what is good for humanity are sometimes at odds. And under capitalism, what happens is that what is profitable sort of takes precedent most of the time.
Yeah. So one thing I might say, if I'm going to make it like a consequentialist argument, and I don't really call myself a consequentialist, but one thing would see, which would be majorly different between like cooperatives and capitalist enterprises, is the lack of that class divide. So obviously workers are the bulk of our society, or the bulk of our communities. And so therefore, and I don't just mean like the industrial working class and all that. That's a dying trend. I'm talking about people who just work and make value. That's the working class. And by this, for the audience, I'm also including GPs who might earn quite a lot of money, general practitioners, doctors, if there's any language divide between Americans and English people. But I'm including all workers in that. So if these things were cooperativized, if capital was cooperativized, then there's no longer a class divide in the profit motive, as in there's no longer a clash of interest in the capitalist's profit or the owner's profit and the workers' wages, or what the workers wish to do with the products of their labour. And so what that would then mean is, because workers live in their communities, but they live in working class communities, and they have control over what they produce. What we see with cooperatives is far more community engagement and like community investment and community funding and charitable donations, etc. It's far more common in cooperatives. The reason that is because talk about the profit motive. A profit motive is just self-interest, really. It's self-interest in economic terms. I go out and work not because I love humanity, but because I want to be richer at the end of the day. I want to have a better standing of living than which I used to do. Now, for a capitalist, they live in quite isolated communities and they, gated neighborhoods, private islands. I'm talking about the extreme billionaires here, the people who
they're alienated.
Most of them, they're very alienated from working class society, and so they have pretty much no incentive to actively promote or actively invest in these working class communities. Workers do. The reason is they live in them. So if there's a problem with youth crime, for example, then worker cooperatives in a particular area will direct investment to youth clubs or strategies which can help with that. Why? Because it makes the communities which those workers who own the capital much more safer. Who wouldn't want that? Well, they wouldn't. I call them idiots not to do it. If there's bad roads, and the roads are full of potholes, well, you can just invest in something like that. It's like a public investment fund for each cooperative, and this is typically how cooperatives today work, both worker and consumers, because obviously consumers also live in the community. So to me, that's the consequentialist point I was going to make, which is the profit motive for workers is far more community oriented than capitalist ones. And I made this point to Hakeem and fellow traveller in my response to those YouTubers. Another one, environment. So it's the same story, I think, because the people who are going to be affected most by climate change is the working class, and not just in Britain or America, but especially in this developing world. And it's a developing world which is pretty much leading the way in terms of like emissions. I'm talking about China here. So a cooperative world where people directly control their output would be much quicker incentivized to look and invest in alternatives, as cooperatives today do. Cooperatives are typically also more environmentally friendly than typical capitalist firms. They are very focused on finding out green alternatives because they themselves, the owners of the capital, are going to be the most affected by by private change, climate change. So that's my consequentialist argument for it. But my real argument for it, so all of that is like, if you're a consequentialist and I can't quite convince you against consequentialism, then that's that little tidbit there. But my real argument for it is obviously going to be my egoist philosophy. So in terms of human benefit or things like that, I kind of put that as a second thinking point. And I tend to promote things like self-interest. Why? Because I think people own themselves, and I think people have no objective obligation to other people apart from, just how those people would benefit them in their lifestyle. The reason being is because it goes all the way down to the meaning of life. The meaning of life, as Camus put it, is pretty much whatever you're doing that makes you want to keep it. So it's all based on your value for your own life, which makes a logical conclusion for me to say that you need to do everything you can to make your life as good as possible. Otherwise, there's no point living it. I can that might not make much sense, but I can probably try and explain it more with some questions.
Oh yeah, I can sort of understand that. It's explicitly an individualist. I think that's probably where we part ways, because I wouldn't consider myself necessarily an individualist. Mostly in the context of I don't really recognize a self that sort of exists absent from other social relations and connections. So for the most part, I sort of just understand that I, as an entity, there's like a more complex string of social connections and power relations that associate with that. But as far as the profit motive thing itself goes, that I do think that a more community thing might reduce alienation, but I still think that profit is itself inherently alienating. Because in this context, then, in mutualist society, there's probably going to be currency. And in the context of currency, then, what's going to happen is there's going to be some group of people that is more richer than others. And that in itself is going to be sort of alienating. Especially when it comes to like certain working class people who maybe have access to resources. Some resources are just more important than others, too. So I guess more concerns there is that fundamentally speaking, in a societies where there's more power, there's more money, there's going to be more power, and that sort of can have some situations where they reduce agency. A concern that I may have going forward is that it seems that you sort of like you may have turned was more autocratic into something more oligarchical, in the sense that, well, okay, now it's not going to be this one CEO who's going to have control over the water supply through this company. It's going to be like a collective who still has control over this company. And that's still alienating in the sense that, well, they still own this stuff, but water is something that like everyone in that society would need. So that in that sense, they're still sort of reliant on them because it's not necessarily collectively owned. It's just, well, it's owned by, this group of people. So I do think, so the concern for me is that profit in and of itself is alienating. And of course, the other concern is that, again, there are things that fall out of human need that are profitable. Now they're more likely to be involved, but there's still a situation where X company or X collective can decide to just dump toxic waste into the other side of the community, or in a river into the other side of the community, because they themselves probably won't be affected by it. And it's an externality that you don't have to pay. So I do think that while it may solve some issues, I do think some of the externalities that still exist in our current market society could possibly exist in a full mutual society. But that's not a concern. I do think most anarchists are usually fine with a plurality of economic systems, and I'm assuming that you're sort of fine with that as well. Like, you wouldn't mind if we had a society what has some elements of maybe a gift economy, or maybe a market economy, or maybe a more syndicalist notion as well. That would probably be fine with you.
Yeah, I identify, or one of the many labels I go by would be a pan-anarchist, as in I do welcome alternative strategies for like resource distribution, as long as they're voluntary. A commune can exist in a anarchist society, as they did, by the way, in Ukraine. In anarchist Ukraine, there was different kinds of models within different territories. There was some were mutualist, some were communist, some were collectivist, some were syndicalist. Catalonia had a similar setup as well, but more syndicalist, because the CNT was far more influential than the Black Army was in Ukraine. But to get to one of the main points you made about rivers, I think one of the concerns about water supplies. And water supplies are pretty much a natural monopoly, aren't they? So I have actually got an answer for those. So with natural monopolies, and I would say that most people, everyone in the community was going to use that water supply. I do actually advocate consumer ownership of those natural monopolies. Same goes for roads, actually. I'm not convinced on selling selling roads off to just road workers, or selling off water supplies to people who work in those places. I think they should be consumer owned. Maybe as cooperatives, maybe as like a communal project thing or whatever. But so with that question, I think that answers it. In terms of the more general problem about potential labour aristocracies, I'll still probably say, well, as long as there exists a market, it boils down to the use of usufruct property rights, and they are selling a product for a price, and they kind of wish to be reimbursed on that price. So they're putting the labour in, they kind of want something back for it. I'm not saying like, I'm not going to make the Ben Shapiro argument where anything collectively owned is slavery, but I'm generally saying a market will be able to figure itself out in terms of if you want this product, then you can have that product for this price, and then you got to compete with other agencies which are providing that product. I'm not really massively against wealth inequality, because I think wealth inequality is only really a problem when you have something like absentee ownership, as in if you can buy other people's land, or if you can accumulate property to the point where you control other people's households or other people's workplaces, then that is the problem. That is the problem, as in you're disassociating people from their own labour. Then the next problem was about natural monopolies, and then possible hazards like dumping toxic waste in certain areas. Well, I think if you have a usufruct owned, if all the land was owned by some organisation or another, be it a nature reserve organisation, like in Britain we have National Trust. I think that could be its own independent organisation, and obviously run by the people who work on them. If you dump waste there, then I think they have the right to sue you, as in you're violating their usufruct property rights. Same goes for the ocean. I think the ocean could be communally owned to some degree. So that at that point, if you're dumping toxic waste into the ocean, or you're pumping out toxins into the air, then I'd say you are liable for violence, because you are inevitably destructing, damaging other people's property, including communally owned property like the ocean and the air, or someone's water supply.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, maybe we can even make the case that it might be fine for them to resist that. But if we sort of understand, though, that profit can, in some cases, lead to certain externalities, it would, I think that sort of like encourages me to maybe we should think past the profit motive, or we should like maybe sort of directly sort of address human need instead of trying to maximize profit. I actually do think that when it comes to certain things like child labor laws, or certain things like the diamond monopolies or other monopolies, I'm not sure they necessarily sorted themselves out. A lot of those things usually require a lot of like specific government intervention to make sure that that kind of didn't, or either government intervention or like mass political uprising action to make sure these things didn't perpetuate. So unless you're gonna, but obviously if this is anarchist, then we're not gonna have such state apparatus. So unless you're just gonna say that, well, if something happens, the people can just revolt against it, I would be fine with that, but I would still be like, at that point, though, it seems like why not just sort of remove the profit motive altogether to avoid these issues?
In the case of human need, that's the main point. The profit motive is pretty much based on human need, effectively. Because the reason being, like, if you want to create a profit, you need to create products which people need/want. Maybe consider there's a difference between those two, but like food is needed, and so therefore it's profitable to invest in providing food. That's pretty much how, I know it's how capitalism works, but it's also how a mutualist economy would also work. With regard to child labour laws, even in the capitalist economy, that kind of did work itself out. Child labour was on the decline. It was massively declining up until the American government got rid of it. It was practically non-existent when the American government abolished child labour. And the reason that was because it was unprofitable to hire children. Whilst you got a population of unemployed workers, unemployed adults with less spending power, the market the owners or the controllers of the market realize that actually the spenders are going to be adults, and so therefore it's better to have adults employ adults. It's better to have the adults with the money and not the children. So that it was resolved through market forces, and also people were campaigning against it, abstaining from buying from companies that used child labor, and so it became generally unprofitable.
I think that's actually maybe a potentially more interesting question, because I think that this might have to do with like some of Lenin's work when he says imperialism, the highest form of capitalism. A lot of things that sort of happened around that time was that America and other like maybe first world capitalist countries are sort of just offshoring a lot of this stuff. So like maybe in this specific country this wasn't happening, but for the most part they were still, and I think to this day are still relying on some child labor in maybe some third world countries to still produce that. And again, this is where it becomes a concern in a mutualist society, because the alienation that usually would still sort of exist to the extent of, well, this community is not really going to be too much caring about like some third world country. They're still going to be profitable to use that. So because they're still alienated, they can still end up having similar sort of offshoring, similar issues of capitalism when it comes to that, relying on other labor of imperialized nations in the past to make a profit. And for me, I'm not sure I would see the distinction between a private owner doing it and a collective of workers deciding to do the exact same thing.
Well, I'd ask, in a world without absentee property, how a cooperative could enforce its position over a group of workers in a different country. Because effectively, if we have absentee property laws, if we have property working on in terms of usufruct property, then the people even in the third world countries or developing world countries, they will be the owners of their labor, and then they'll effectively sell on that to the first world. So I think there'll be less incentive even then for there to be like harsh labor law, harsh working conditions against themselves and child labor. For example, and also a cooperative has incentive to keep work or keep labor in that country. So outsourcing is going to be even less of an incentive, because so let's say you have a workers' cooperative and they all vote to outsource the labor to somewhere in Africa. So what have they done? They've fired themselves, haven't they? Effectively, I don't think that would be a good idea.
No, well, again, so collective ownership just means all the profits of the company will be collectively shared amongst them, instead of just with that whoever the CEO and maybe whoever the shareholders was. If it's still more profitable to do that, then for whatever labor cost or whatever it might entail in thing, maybe the machines are cheaper over there. Maybe they're willing to pay less or over there for other reasons. So, and this is again a bigger potential issue when it comes to resources. You can say that, well, we can all sell this, but again, the use value sort of does become relevant in the sense that if some resources are more valuable than others, and some countries are in need of values more than others, that still has a possible leverage of social power that can be used, especially if we're still assuming the profit motive. So like maybe because I think that in that context, I might be fine with like again mutualism as like maybe for like more luxury goods. I probably might be fine with that, but I think my biggest contention is sort of like the idea of profit motive, but we're still having like this profit motive is around like necessary goods like food, healthcare, things like environmental things like that. I think that's probably where my biggest contentions might lie with that.
So yeah, I mean, in terms of markets, I don't really restrict them necessarily to the profit motive. In fact, market anarchists get memed a lot for saying everything is the market, and the reason we do that is because a market is just consensual exchange. So it could be I give you something in exchange for nothing. So the market would therefore include mutual aid groups and even like redistribution networks, like that you've seen like an anarcho-communist society. So those things would be fully compatible with with my society. So if there's a point where the cash nexus isn't supplying people with everything they need, then there is opportunity for other kinds of organizations like mutual aid networks to step in and redistribute according to those lines. And that's typically what happens in anarchist societies throughout history. Like they tend to start off anarcho-communist, and then markets cooperative markets will be reintroduced because they typically have difficulties with coordination and stuff, so they end up relying on trade as a means of coordinating where to put these resources, where the resources are needed, where the demand is, that kind of thing. And then those mutual aid networks to cover out to cover the basics still operate because people like them, and they still are compatible with with their values and all the rest of it. So as far as that's concerned, it just seemed to me that I could even agree with what you just saying. As in there'll be a mix or a plurality, as you'd like to say, of different systems operating within the same area to provide people with things that they need. I think it'll be a matter of prediction of I predict that a market economy which will see that there's a demand for food or a demand for materials to create housing, and obviously no laws to prevent housing being built, because that's one of the major problems. It's difficult to get planning permission to build new houses. It's not a market at all. If you have a market that's based on that, then those things should be covered by it anyway. You'll have a minority of extreme examples of people who are homeless or people who just don't have a job or don't have access to resources like that, and still those people could be covered by those kind of mutual aid networks I was talking about, which you would also advocate as a communist.
Yeah, like mutual aid is fine in the sense that, because if you're talking about a conception of markets that don't necessarily have to entail a profit motive, then I think I could be perfectly fine with that. In that case, then I could probably just advocate a removal of the profit motive entirely. But of course, as a communist, I probably would be against currency and other things. So for the most part, yeah, I can definitely see that would work. If you're just saying we're exchanging, although technically a gift economy wouldn't be exchange, but but I think that has more to do with again what the society has and what the factors of production would be in said society. But yeah, for the most part, I'm fine with that. Then if it doesn't necessarily have to entail a profit motive, if it does entail a profit motive, then that sort of does. That's where the issues come in, partially of currency, of alienation, of a few people sort of accruing power, and I think that has another alienating effect in certain resource allocations that might tend to go along with that.
So, out of interest, how do you think your society would allocate resources without the central planning apparatus of the technocratic state, which is seen from Leninists, and without the supply-demand curve that we get from markets?
So a lot of anarchist the anarchist theory on that usually tells you to go either the more decentralized planning route, which is it's gonna sound like syndicalism, where it's basically going to be it could be either a bunch of trade networks, like a large decentral network of how is it? It's still like an economic plan, but it's definitely going to be basically where it's going to be a network of disparate economic agents. So it's going to be a bunch of not companies, a bunch of separate things coordinating amongst each other. That or a gift economy where it's not really going to even be exchanged, but because it's not really going to even exchange, because it's not it's not like a trade for a trade. It's just otherwise you need this, and then you're supplied with it, and then if someone else needs that, but that requires also common ownership. So that couldn't function under certain aspects anyway. But this is sort of why that's sort of relevant. But that's definitely the more thing. I think Catalonia system was the syndicalist one. That was a little more of the decentral planning, where it's just a bunch of disparate economic agents. It's planning, but it's planning on a more mass, decentralized scale. Which I think is very interesting.
It still operated with exchange though. It was instead of currency, it was labor vouchers, wasn't it?
For Catalonia specifically, I think there was labor vouchers. Yeah, I don't think it has to entail currency, but it could.
Yeah. So let's say let's do the vegan thing. Let's say we had a hypothetical, and we've got a fisherman's union or fisher people's union in New York. I don't know how fishing works in America. Forgive me. Let's pretend a lot of fishing was done in America, in New York. How would those people then know where to distribute the fish? According to, do they just send it out equally, or do they get a list from other settlements throughout the United States, or do they have it conducted by some higher authority?
Oh, okay, yeah. This actually sounds sort of reminiscent of like the economic calculation problem.
Oh
which
yeah,
is,
yeah.
yeah, that's
Old
fine for
vices.
them. I think that's actually a really interesting question. I think because I think the language learner system was sort of an interesting answer to that. But basically, for the most part, that's been addressed with through things like, well, one, that they know the fact that in capitalism, a lot of planning still happens when it comes to certain resources. But for the most part, it can sort of just be as simple as having like, let's say this is the first time this happened, we could maybe have a poll of how people want X to be distributed, and then from there produce according it, and then you can make slight adjustments based on how much it's being taken, how much is not being taken. Those are sort of things that can be done um, outside of necessarily a pricing mechanism. I think it'll be functional. And in the People's Republic of Walmart, they already make the fact that internally speaking, it's already super planned out about how things are going. So I think it's actually a really interesting concept.
Yeah, so to start off with, would you need to literally distribute the fish everywhere evenly and then see how the demand works?
Not necessarily. Again, the idea is
How
to
would you
distribute.
start it off?
Well, again, the idea is polling according to the idea is like, for example, polling. How many people want? How many people like? We can use another example of wheelchairs. Distributing a wheelchair to everyone is not necessary because not everyone needs a wheelchair. So you might have a thing of like, who for example has like who is in need of a wheelchair. That might involve coordination with hospitals. Maybe some nursing homes and things like that. And then from there, they can produce according, maybe slightly more, but according to that, and they can sort of just address it to those people.
Right.
And then of course,
So
yeah.
I'll let you finish your point.
Okay, yeah, and it could be distributed there. Now, is it possible that it can have a shortage in some areas? Sure, of course, shortages exist in systems, and you can sort of make adjustments as needed after the initial, I guess, polling and coordination is done. But I don't think this is necessarily something that's like super, but necessarily needs a price. Like you can use prices for it, and it's fine to use it. Well, in some cases, but for the most part, a combination of just that and currently with the technology that we have right now, that actually can make a lot of socialist planning a lot easier.
And then so we got a poll, and that tells us where people want the fish and how many people want the fish and how much fish the people want, sort of thing, in different areas. So
that's how you do it initially, right? And then we can produce X amount, and then depending on again how much is being taken, so we can use that to determine the demand. We can either produce more or produce less. So it'll be a constantly adjusting process, in the same way that markets now constantly adjust based on how many people tend to take or not use or use.
Yeah. So obviously, our fishing syndicate in New York isn't going to be the only fishing syndicate. You've also got Boston to the north. I think Boston's to the north of New York, and who's to the south? I don't know. So you got a version of the south. Sorry, my US geography is not great.
Wait, but are they competing with each other? Why are we competing?
No, they're not competing. They're not competing.
Oh, so we just coordinate with them then. So in that case, that way we can avoid issues of we're all producing for this area when now we're overproduced for this area. So in that case, then definitely the hope would be that you would coordinate with all producers in your area, so you can see where you're going to be distributing it out to.
Yeah. So you talk with them, and you then decide on how many fish each company produces, and each company you then decide with each other. So these decisions are going to have to be made through a more centralized authority, aren't they? Really, because it's not going to be those three fishing companies. It's going to be syndicates. It's going to be a lot, isn't it?
That'll be decentral, right? Because again, it's a large amount of disparate actors planning together. And the idea of central planning was not that like disparate actors are planning. It's usually that there's like a specific body, like basically there's a specific body sort of above the people doing that necessarily, not like a large amount of like planners and people from different industries. That was a bit different.
So how would decentralized planning in that case work? So if you say, we coordinate together, is it a case where one syndicate or one group would say, we're going to produce this much fish and we're going to send it off to this area, and then another one just tells them, we're producing this much, we send it that area, blah blah blah? Or is it we elect a group of people who are good at this sort of stuff, and they do the calculations, and they come forward with how much each company is supposed to produce and where they're supposed to produce, and etc.
Well, that's sort of I think the beauty of anarchism, right, is that this is like voluntary association. So the idea here is that they sort of decide if that what they want to do. Now, in smaller areas where there's not going to be as many people or there's not any production, it probably could just be a 100% direct democracy amongst people, and they can decide. But in larger areas, it actually might be the case that they might have to do a teensy bit of a representative democracy because it may be less practical for it to have like millions of people sort of coordinate that. It may be the fact that you might have to have like a very like a group of small but directly accountable people that can directly be voted out if needed to. But for the most part, the idea of voluntary association is they can sort of decide the more specifics of how they want to organize that.
Fair enough. And but there might be clashes of interest there, mightn't there? Because say one group of people want to produce a particular amount of fish. Another group of people might want to produce less fish than what's needed or what's required. So, hang on. What I'm trying to say is, in terms of pay, or in terms of like how people get back out of their labour, whatever incentive that might be, if it's like flat and equal, everyone gets the sort of same income or same number of labour vouchers or whatever, same standard of living than before, then there might be incentives for certain fishing companies to say, look, we want to do less work.
Yeah, well, I mean, first, a few things. We're not like in the theory of like how communism work. It wouldn't be that necessarily they all have the same. It would just be that it's all collectively owned. That's actually the idea, is that they all sort of have a say in how they're distributed. It doesn't have to be distributed equally. In the same way that, again, not everyone needs a wheelchair, so not everyone's going to get a wheelchair. Not everyone has the exact same particular desires of standards of living. So you're still going to see some variance there. But the idea is how much control do they have is going to be the distinguishing factor. As far as them working less, yes, and that's sort of a good thing actually. A lot of socialists sort of say that we don't need to work as much as we do. We also sort of point out that people in like even medieval societies would take more vacations. So the idea there would be that as we're sort of shifting towards this, we might even take advantage of certain factors of automation to sort of move away from work entirely. So
I'm in favour of that as well. Just one thing. The only concern with that would be if a group of people think they're working perhaps too much because they're getting compared to like what they're getting out of it, and they decide actually no, we don't want to work as much or we don't want to produce as much, then you might have some problems with a clash of interests in those areas. So if
of course, that's true for anything, right? If no one wants to do X, no one's going to do X. Yeah.
And if it's the other way around, as in terms of people are paid by fish or paid by the amount of work they do, then there's going to be a competition amongst those companies to deliver as much fish to as many people, because they want to be as rich as possible or take home a lot more than possible. Take home as much as possible.
Money can be an incentive. I don't think it's like a principle, especially in a socialist society where for the most part it needs to be covered, right? Like, well, the reason I'm working now isn't because I'm trying to be as rich as possible. I just want to be economically stable. Like, if I have all of my material needs covered, like, I wouldn't work because anyway. So unless there's like a specific deprivation where it's like, if I do not work, I'm not going to have economic stability, that can equally be, and this is sort of also another concern of the profit motive, is that it does sort of incentivize you to have a large underclass of people who do need the money, because otherwise, if let's say like in America right now, the government says, you know what, everyone gets $3,000 every a month, for UBI or something. I'm not working because I don't need to work. Well, I'm not trying to be as rich as possible. I was just trying to meet like some minimum threshold of economic stability. In that instance, I already have no particular incentive to want to work any job anyway. So I think price can work up to an extent, but even that price thing sort of works only to some extent with economic deprivation. But I think price can be a motivator in some contexts. So I'm fine for using it in some contexts, but I don't think it's like a universal motivator in areas where other things can't be. Like social praise can be a motivator. Personal validation from work can be a motivator. And they have been, because currency hasn't always existed, but people have worked before. So I don't think that it will be difficult to find one in a post-currency society.
Yeah, so I think although people might not have the incentive to become Jeff Bezos rich, I think as long as there's more luxuries than you can get at the moment, or there's always like a little there's a bit more money to be earned possibly, There's always going to be that incentive or that desire to get that little bit more each time, for most people anyway, because that would mean having a nicer TV, affording a nicer car, having a nicer home, adding little bits of whatever to the home, those kinds of, just a little bit, having a little bit more of a luxurious life more. So in that instance, I think, and if people are paid perhaps according to how much fish they deliver, there's going to be a competition, I think, or a clash of interests in terms of, we want to deliver as much fish as possible in order to attain as big an income as possible. And so that kind of competition between those fishing syndicates is going to create a problem which I think will need to be addressed through some kind of centralization.
Yeah, again, if we're assuming a profit motive, which again, the idea of decentral planning was that it wouldn't be a profit motive, then yes, that could be a problem. But in this context, the idea there is like alternate systems that don't have to necessitate a profit motive, that way we don't have competition. Because that's sort of like, especially for like communism, the goal is that there wouldn't be competition because there's not any need to. All the wealth that exists in a society is commonly owned. So there's not really any particular need for wealth incentive because you already own the wealth.
Well, if you own it, you want to have more access to it. And one of the ways Spain allowed people to have more access to it was in the form of labour vouchers, as we agreed a second ago. And so workers still competed with each other for places in work, or to deliver as much work as possible, to attain as much labour vouchers as possible, in order to drink as many beers as possible, or just
Yeah, and for some people that was
a big thing
in
Spain.
So the thing that's the ideal here is that like it can be a motivator for some, right? But for others who don't, that's also fine too. They can just stay at home and do it, and live their other desires. And I think being able to maybe satisfy both people, there might be maybe a competitive spirit that might exist where they might want to work more. And I don't think it's necessarily the case that, if I have wealth, I want more access to it. I think that's more of a person-to-person thing and less like a human nature kind of thing.
Okay, fair enough. I've just seen the thing from SD. He says we'll move to the Q&A shortly. I think we've pretty much gone through our differences anyway.
I think
unless you've got any more questions for me.
No, I think it was actually really productive. So
yeah. So yeah, SD, we're happy to go into Q&A. SD.
Hello, sorry, I just came back from taking a leak. What was the last
thing? I was about to take over.
You fell asleep, didn't you?
No,
I was about to be like, this is my BC now.
Went to Point Percy at the Porcelain. But I guess you guys have finished your discussion. Certainly appreciate the quality of it. All very polite and very on topic, which is excellent. I guess we should hand it over to Q&A, but I'm not expecting a big fireworks show. I don't know if anybody has any questions. If anybody does and you're not able to unmute yourself, just give me a 1 in the chat. Right, Neolib has a question. Right, okay. I'm gonna unmute Neolib. There you go, you're on the mic. You can ask your question to whoever it's directed to.
Okay. Can y'all hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Let me pull it up real quick. Yeah, so my question was, has the labor theory of value proven to be effective at determining how scarce resources ought to be distributed anywhere in history?
Well, I have no idea. As far as, because this seems to teeter on economic calculation problem stuff as well. I'm not necessarily sure to what extent. Maybe like the only examples I can think of that might have used it was maybe the Soviet Union or maybe China, because I know anarchists usually don't care about it that much. To what extent, can we say that this was the sole defeater of sex thing, or that they could not determine scarcity? Probably not, particularly for the USSR, because reading into the history of it was kind of interesting, because they kind of just didn't give a shit. It's one thing if they tried and failed to try to gauge consumer demand, but for the most part, they kind of just did not care about consumer demand. Now, that's partially because Stalin was not good, and also the planners themselves were generally incompetent. So I'm not sure. It could be the case that it could fail, but at least in the case of the USSR, I don't even think it was particularly attempted. It was kind of just
Okay, so why would you advocate for the labor theory of value?
I don't. I would
We
just
don't.
put. Yeah,
Okay.
none of us do. Yeah.
Okay.
One thing I'd say, just to sort of add on to MrCuddles, would be Catalonia had a good system. We mentioned this in the debate. That was labour vouchers, and so what they did is they pretty much said, well, okay, this much labour, these labour hours gets you this much labour vouchers, and that worked fairly effectively actually, because workers still work. They were still very much enthusiastic to go out and work for their company, for their union as it was. And they spent those labour vouchers enjoying the fruits of the collective labour, and that's just how it worked, and it did work. But it wasn't a case of labour theory of value wasn't used to like determine where things went. I think they use other signals for that, as perhaps as MrCuddles mentioned. He mentioned polling. He mentioned and other things, but. Labour theory of value is not used to measure how you coordinate things. Patty.
Yeah, thanks for the answer. I think Patty has a question next, so go right ahead.
Yeah, so I found the small discussion that you were having with Cuddles to be very, very productive. But I do have a question concerning the environmental aspect of anarchism. I know from the framework that you explained in previous discussions, ThoughtBat, where you talked about how your kind of society is pictured as very small, if not no central authority. If one does exist, it's extremely small. And then these are like groups of essentially communes who exist together and sometimes interact with other communes. But the main point of it all in anarchism is for people to not like transgress upon each other, right?
Pretty much, yeah.
Broadly, there's a bit of nuance to that.
Right. So, if the point is generally to not transgress upon each other, I was a little bit confused about your answer to how, like, for example, if one commune were to start dumping toxic waste because maybe they do industrialization in theirs in comparison to another commune that engages in agriculture, right? If one like were to dump toxic waste, how would I mean, like, I didn't really I just got a bit confused about your answer, but how does one commune come to another about this issue? At some point, if that commune kept doing it, would it not devolve into violence, and would that be justified?
It's going to devolve into violence some way or another. Like even if there's like legal process now, violence will be used or threatened to be used to hold those people accountable. Now, I don't necessarily think communes will be incredibly localized. I don't believe in council communism, if that's what you mean. I mean, what I typically refer to is polycentric legal regimes, and cooperatives can form part of these things. So I imagine one cooperative will be constituent members of one legal regime, and the other cooperatives will be members of another, and those have to interact. So those legal regimes would be called into. Sorry, before we go into that, those legal regimes would, I assume, acknowledge each other exists, and so therefore they will make deals with each other as to how disputes will be managed. This happens between countries at the moment. If there's a transgression of one country against someone from one country against another person in another country, then countries already have agreements with each other on how to go about resolving that dispute. And so polycentric legal regimes can do that as well. So let's say cooperative A is with legal regime A, and they dump toxic waste on cooperative B's property, and cooperative B is with legal regime B. Well, legal regime A and B are both going to have some kind of agreement on how to resolve this dispute. Effectively, cooperative A has transgressed against cooperative B and has either reduced their economic value or damaged their goods or whatever, or they've harmed people in the process. And so legal regime A, well, legal regime B is going to go to A and say, look, this has happened. Here is the evidence that has happened. We expect this much to be paid. Now, if the legal regime A kind of refuses to uphold its promises, then it should no longer be seen as a effective legal regime, and therefore it's going to be acceptable to expropriate the property of that, and then carry on.
A stateless court system sounds really interesting, but
it's complicated. It's weird. It's complicated. I don't really like talking about it, but it's important, so it needs to be talked about.
Yeah, like theories of justice and anarchism is pretty broad as well, because there's likely going to be a plurality of justice systems. I personally don't like courts because a lot of what you just said almost sounds like a state.
Literally,
like there needs to be
that's my big
apparatus.
problem.
Yeah,
that's the big problem, right? Is that when you explain this stuff, there has to be someone to, number one, create the rules, or whether it be like a group of people to create the rules. And generally societies don't like it when people who are necessarily ignorant or not intelligent try to create the rules. They like those people who are less intelligent to implement the rules, as like in comparison to, like, for example, politicians and law enforcement. Politicians usually being more educated individuals, law enforcers usually not being the more educated individuals. So it's kind of, I understand, like, it makes sense, right, that you say it's a very complicated issue, because it inevitably, to me, sounds like a state.
Well, yeah, and my answer for this question would be then that if the goal of anarchism is of how a society as harmonious as possible, we sort of don't want these kind of situations to even happen in the first place, which is why I would then say argue even harder against the profit motive. It seems that if there's situations where we're all acting in a sense of personal profit, that tends to lead to conflict if exploiting you or dumping toxic waste is a profitable thing. So that's why I would say first things you can do at a base level is to do as much as we can to prevent these kinds of situations. And if they happen, then I'm not a libertarian, so I don't necessarily hold a non-aggression principle. If some people are dumping waste, they might have to be confronted. Maybe non-violently at first, but I'm not opposed to using violence to sort of ward them off if it comes to that.
I mean, calling it a state, it depends how you define state, I suppose. I define a state as a monopoly in force over a given territory. A polycentric legal order will necessarily not be a monopoly in force, because you can leave one legal regime and then negotiate with others. So I wouldn't call that a state. I would call that a stateless legal order. I suppose if your problem is authority existing, and therefore not anarchist, well, I suppose you just have different definitions. I mean, no one defines anarchism as a completely lawless or ruleless society.
You'd be surprised.
Apart from, like, no anarchist does it.
Not the like more actual philosophical anarchists. Maybe some ANCAPs or ANPrimes do, but
ANCAPs have court systems, proposed ideas for court as well, arbitration as well. David Freeman's written books on it, how law and order can be obtained in an ANCAP society. The only group I'd probably say would be the kind of anarchists that we don't like would be illegalists, as in they literally just go around and do what they want, rob on people, kill people and stuff. And they're more like nihilists, and no one really cares about them. No one takes them seriously.
Okay. Yeah, and for the most part,
what I think we should do, like, sorry to cut you off, MrCuddles, like, it wasn't because that you were speaking, but I think it would be useful if you guys maybe made like a short closing statement each, and then we go back to the Q&A, and it's purely for the sake of the recording. I'm more than happy to stop it after you've had your closing statements.
Okay, not a problem.
MrCuddles, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure, I can go first. So, broadly speaking, as you stated, most anarchists are fine with a plurality of economic systems, so it's not like I'm intrinsically against mutualism. No, far from it. But I do think that there are some concerns of the profit motive that tend to at least have me some skepticism towards the idea, unless there's like some heavy and like thorough regulation system in place. And it's that regulation system, there's certain issues where it can end up just having a state. And this is sort of, again, some core theories about like if capitalism and the profit motive are sort of intertwined in that sense. Because it would seem that the best way to secure the profit motive without all these externalities that we dislike would just be to have a state apparatus. And in that case, we're no longer anarchists. That's my primary concern.
So I'll go next. Yeah, as MrCuddles says, anarchists are quite in favour of plurality of systems and organisations and etc. It even showed in the debate where MrCuddles said, well, there might be problems with distribution as far as the cash nexus is concerned, or what I call the cash nexus is concerned. And so then I basically said, well, the cash nexus won't be the only way these things are distributed. There'll be mutual aid networks. The way I think mutualism will evolve is probably from an anarcho-communist attempt, and then we'll still have the more communistic roots and the communistic apparatus in place, and then markets just come in and hoover up on the problems I think come with on the calculation, come with a calculation problem. And I think this happens in anarchist societies in history. So, for example, they've each tried to be communist, but then markets always creep back in because people decide, actually, I'd like to trade my stuff with them. A currency emerges. It might not be a fiat currency or a gold standard currency or silver standard, but some kind of currency emerges, and then we have trade networks establishing themselves once again. And that's part of mutualism. Mutualism is actually in favour of free currency, not as in currency you just get for the sake of it, but like as in no one controls what currency you use. There's no central bank or anything like that.
Superb.
As far as... I'm not done yet. I'm not done.
Oh, sorry. I thought you were. Carry on.
My primary reason goes all the way back to egoism. People, I think, are completely responsible for their own existence, and so therefore they ought to make that existence valuable for themselves. So that means they have to prioritize their own self-interest, and that means they go forward and they interact people with self-interest in mind. One of the ways we can facilitate this is through recognizing each other's usufruct property rights, because in order to live, you necessarily need to manipulate the material objects around you in order to keep living. For example, you need to eat food, you need to live in a house, you need to wear clothing to keep warm, etc. So I think we all agree that usufruct property is justified. This doesn't scale up to absentee property, of course, but through these property rights, I think exchange is justified, and so therefore the resultant market is also justified. Whether or not this solves all the problems, it probably won't solve all the problems, but where it doesn't, that's where I think anarcho-communists will step in, and they'll have going by their appeals to mutual aid, they will redistribute accordingly. And this is in people's self-interest as well, because an impoverished community doesn't work out for the people living in that community. And when people have control of the resources that they produce, like in cooperatives, then they have direct incentive to participate in that mutual aid. And so I think this is where we have bridged the gap, and this is where we all agree most, as in market forces will hoover up where a communist society wouldn't do very well, and communist forces will hoover up where the market society doesn't do well. And so that's where we're up. That's where we're up to, I think.
Okay, thank you for your closing statement. Thank you both for turning up for the discussion. It was interesting, and I intend to listen back to it because I think there was a few points that I missed. Excellent and quite interesting and very civil, which is always appreciated here. Good quality discussion. So all I'm going to do right now is I'm going to stop recording. That doesn't mean that you can't continue the discussion. It's just that this is where the recording will stop. So yeah, thanks everybody for turning up, and hopefully it continues. We'll see you all soon.
Yep. Yeah.
There we go.